It's cycling. Let me try it again, Doug. I'll tell you as soon as it goes on. It's just
okay.
Okay. I think we're in business now. Good. Hi, everybody. Good evening from your Vitality Project. I'm Bob Weathers, and I'm here with my dear friend and our special guest, Doug Prater. Welcome, Doug.
Hi, thanks, Bob. It's good to see you tonight.
Good to have you here. Thank you. I'm going to type up our topic for tonight is how to turn your requirements into preferences. And I want to talk into this with you, Doug. As you know, this is the material that was developed by our mutual friend, Guy Duplessis, and it's derived from his book that he co-authored with Stanley Block, and it's called The Mind-Body Workbook for Addiction Recovery. And Guy and I are working right now on a revised second edition of that book, and I've been working with this material because of that project. And it includes a pretty hefty component of mindfulness, which I've completed kind of a unit of that material in the last few weeks here at Vitality Project, and more recently moved into more of the cognitive or the mental aspects. And this piece right here, that's at the heart of tonight's conversation between you and me, Doug, is about how it is that when we create absolute requirements on reality to conform with my wishes or else, that it correlates highly with the activation of what I call, in our post today, in the last few days, I call it the red alert brain. It's really the limbic system, the emotional center of the brain. That gets recruited much to the dismay of the frontal cortex. And I call that the resting brain. That would be the executive network. So it turns out that there's a fair correlation between our placing requirements on our experience to be thus and so, and our distress. And that distress for people will go different directions. But in the conversation that you and I have been having about addiction and recovery, it correlates highly with first of all, increased cravings and then increased relapse risk. And so I wanted to talk into that just in whatever way is of interest to you, my friend. It's worth our looking at, and I'd love to make it as applied as possible. So can I leave it at that for right now and just see what you're prompted to reflect on? By the way, I loved your text to me today. I wrote a text today, and I'm going to generalize this, Doug, so you can know that. But I wrote a post today, and it was talking about an exercise where I was inviting people to reflect on distressful interactions as if maybe that's a rare occurrence. And Doug and I laughed about that because you don't have to go very far in a day or a week to run into some kind of bottleneck in relationships. And it's oftentimes in the relationships that we have, in which we have the most investment, that this comes up. So, and I've come with examples tonight too, Doug. It was prompted by your transparency with me. I can look as recently as last night to an interaction where I know that if I stop and analyze it, which I don't typically, particularly in the heat of the moment, that I don't have to go very far. It's not an abstraction.
Yeah. So, this is such a good topic too. It's so key to everything, because you're absolutely right. That red alert brain comes in and takes over, and it's very hard to argue with at that point. But absolutely critical too. And there's such an important point here, which reminds me of Byron Katie's "Loving What Is." A lot of the other literature around acceptance. I'm thinking of a radical acceptance too, which is this idea that if you argue with reality, you will lose.
That doesn't seem to dissuade us, does it?
Yeah, certainly. Definitely. No, I've tried.
By now, we should have mastered it, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. That reframe, though, of getting what I want, getting what I think I have to have to become a preference, really does make all the difference. But it's so difficult to do too. We get into these thought patterns. I get into these thought patterns where I just convince myself that if things don't go a certain way, I'm not going to make it, and I cannot handle it. There's such an important difference between can't and would rather not.
Yeah, yeah. It's not just a semantic difference, is it? I mean, I experienced it last night. I had an interaction with Colleen, my wife, and I responded to her with curtness, and it wasn't so much what I said; it's the way I said it.
Sure.
And I realized it was only after I got your message back to me today that I was reflecting on it, and I was thinking, at the heart of it was she responded to something I shared with her in a way that I didn't like, and that's perfectly okay. But my mulling it over afterwards, my ruminating on it, really made it not okay that she even did that. It was like it's not that I didn't like it; it's that it's not okay. It turned it into an absolute, and I really do believe, even today, Doug, reflecting on it, as I was reflecting on it and began to kind of unpack what had happened, and relax my grip on what I can't control, there was actually grace for her as well as a relaxation. I could feel it. It was palpable. I could feel it in my body. So it didn't happen in the moment, I can guarantee you, but afterwards it has a palliative effect. Even a day later, I'm really grateful for your text back to me. I laughed in response, and then I sat there and I thought, maybe I need to take a look at this.
Yeah.
So it has immediate effect. So it doesn't feel like a far stretch for me if I apply it even a day later. It feels better. I feel better. I feel more relaxed. I even had a healing conversation with Colleen after this, where I came in and I apologized for my curtness, and also was able to name what it was that got evoked for me. It doesn't mean that I have to roll over and play dead. It just gives us a dialogue, and we didn't have a dialogue last night. Yeah.
And that's such an important skill set too, to be able to look inside yourself enough to name that and then to bring it up in dialogue. That's an important part of this healing and repair process too, that helps us mitigate that stress and those red alert moments in the future. As we build proficiency with doing it, we gain confidence in our ability to do it again.
Yeah. You and I have talked about this some, Doug. Colleen's work as a therapist is very much rooted in what's referred to as mentalization. And she does a lot of advanced trainings every year at UCLA in mentalization. And the basic idea of mentalizing is, I'll use my example with Colleen last night, is that I got your text today. I laughed because it was funny to me. And then I kind of dropped into a more reflective space. Thankfully, I had a moment to kind of do that. I began imagining what it felt like for her, for me to respond with that curtness. And that's really at the essence of this idea of mentalizing. Can you imagine the other person's mind? And to do that, you have to have the same capacity with yourself. I have to, okay, now what was going on for me? What might have been going on for her? It's a very complex cognitive function if you think about it. This capacity to really empathize with another person, and then the next piece is to have the humility. One author calls it the fallibility, to just acknowledge that I fouled up, to come to Colleen and to risk her displeasure, but to risk also wanting to heal something, to risk being fallible in front of her,
right?
And hopefully she will be generous with me. She was. All of that is the work that Colleen does. She works with high conflict couples. That's her specialty. And any of us that have been close to anybody in our lives, whether it's a partner or a parent or even an employer, you know how fragile, how difficult that is to access that mentalizing. One thing happens for sure when you and I get anxious or angry or caught in a complex is that we shrink. We reduce down to very concrete ways of thinking, kind of either or, and usually it means I'm good and you're bad, which is messed up, but that's the way it goes.
And the higher the stakes of the interaction too, the more we drop down into that and lose those higher capacities of perspective taking too. It's almost as though we're slipping down rungs in the Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah, it really is. It gets down to where it feels like your survival. You lose the connection. You lose any sense of valuing the other person's autonomy, things that are really core to, your value system. And it really turns into a kind of a battle to the death, it seems like to me. Doug, I'd like to do something in our conversation, and I'd love to hear your reflections on it. We're talking about what's commonplace in relationships. And I appreciate very much what you just said. The more skin in the game we have with a relationship, the more this is in the crosshairs. The more this is going to get evoked. People have come to me over the years. I've seen innumerable couples over the last 4 decades, and oftentimes I've heard this. I don't have this problem with anybody except for my husband.
Yeah.
And kind of duh. and I don't say that, but what I try to say is what you just said, which is, the more investment we have, the more that's at stake, and the more powerfully evoked are our wounds. I mean, our wounds don't come up except in the relationships that matter most to us. And so it's to give grace to one another in this. But I'd like to tie it with you, Doug. I'd like to tie it also into any thoughts that you have about this. I made reference to craving, addictive craving, as well as relapse risk. How might this tie, in your view, that we're talking about this whole issue of placing requirements on ourselves, placing requirements on other people? How might this tie in your experience or your view to the whole addictive cycle? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
Well, craving is certainly an important part of it, especially in the moment. I know that when I find myself activated and in that red alert zone following a confrontation, a high stakes conflict in particular, the more invested I am in the outcome of that not being or being something that I require instead of something that would be nice, then the more pain I am in when that stops. And I know historically one way to get out of that pain, the more it hurts, the more I want that to stop, and the more likely I am to go pick up that drink again. There are so many good tools to stop that, and some of them are more effective than others, and some of them aren't always available. But that's why it's so important that we're going through so many of these in this series. Anything to get your mind off it, to change your state, to reframe your perspective. And it's so hard to do in the moment too. In the middle of a conflict, I find myself deliberately just slowing down and breathing. Take a moment. I'm not going to respond to this. I'm not going to say a word. I'm just going to focus on my breath and meditate while we're sitting here talking. I'm just going to breathe slowly and focus on my heart center in the middle of this conversation, instead of allowing myself to activate and crave. Because if I don't take care of that, then I'm a lot more likely to go and start that whole cycle. And the problem is, were I to do that, times in the past when I have gone and continued that cycle and gotten out of the pain for a minute, then there's the shame of having done that. We're back on that train again. Thank you,
Doug. You remind me, this weekend I had this wonderful opportunity to spend a few days with a dear long-term friend of mine, Kevin Fujimoto. Kevin was a student of mine 25 years ago, doctoral student in psychology. He's been a psychologist all these years, and we spent the better part of the weekend together. And because of COVID, we haven't seen each other for the better part of this year, and it was really a pleasure. One of the things I was most touched by was his sharing with me his parenting of his son, Taylor. His son, Taylor, is just 2 years younger than my daughter, Amanda. And so Kevin and I have kind of accompanied each other in this parenting journey down the way. And Kevin was sharing with me a recent series of interactions with Taylor, where he's helping Taylor in his current relationship do what you just said. Kevin highly values meditative practice and spiritual resources, and he's one of the stellar human beings in my entire life. And he's modeling for his son, and he's actually quite didactic about it. He says, Taylor, you need not to lose it. You need not to lose your top or blow up. He doesn't see value in that. And I don't disagree with Kevin. I just really respect his modeling and then actually teaching his son to do what you talked about, how to, in the moment, either take yourself out of the line of fire if that's necessary, to take a break, a timeout. There's no crime in that. Or like you, and I love what you just said, Doug, to just, if there a way to drop down into your center, your heart center, whatever you want to call it. For me, I just move into a breathing space, because we can do it in the moment up to a certain point. And if you feel like you're losing traction, like I say, take a time out. And we talked about this at length, and I was thinking what a fortunate son Taylor is to have a dad like Kevin. And then I was thinking, whoever gets to be the lucky partner of Taylor gets to be the beneficiary of this kind of training. It's really what you're talking about. You know, I presume that Ava is going to grow up with you as a father, modeling these values, and it's such a gift. I see this in my daughter Amanda. She is incredibly capable of managing conflict in a relationship, most often with like stunning equanimity. My wife Colleen and I will sometimes watch her with the kids, because, as you know, with Ava, kids can take us to the edge of our existence. and Colleen and I will both cry, because it's so moving to see a parent with so much of a buffer against moving into reactive mode or punitive or judgment, all that kind of stuff. And I just completely honor what you just said, Doug. And you know, it's a beautiful thing, and it ties. You and I both are in recovery from severe addiction. It ties directly into I know my own sustained recovery is being able to manage this so that I don't move into one of these places that's like kind of metal on metal, in a sense. I need to keep things fluid, and you're talking about some practical skills to help that.
Those red line moments too are so crucial. That's really when it matters the most. You were talking earlier about the ability to move into someone else's perspective, and I just want to take a moment to reemphasize how powerful that can be too. It can be really difficult to do in the moment, especially, but to gain some practice with that, to gain some skill with that, can be just incredible. Sitting as an exercise on your own and taking the perspective of somebody, really imagining as vividly as we can what it's like to be in another person's shoes, can really do a lot to help get perspective. I got normal cognitive development aside, I got a lot of extra proficiency with that when I was training as an actor and working in the acting field. When you really have to put yourself down inside somebody else's shoe. My acting class was she was an incredible coach, and that was one of the most valuable life growth resources I had, acting aside, because of some of the skills that I learned there. One of which is the ability to really deeply understand where somebody's coming from and what their motivations are, why they want what they want, why they would say something the way they said it. And knowing how to get to that place can do a lot to remove, has done for me a lot to remove my charge around some of the most difficult moments that I've had.
That's beautiful. I'm glad for you to say that. You remind me of something that I haven't thought about for years, Doug. My second year of graduate school, which was exactly 40 years ago in 1980-81, I created a self-study elective. My professor was Neil Warren, and Neil agreed to supervise me on this. And it was, I created a course, and I called it Therapy as Drama. I think that's what I called it. And what I did is I studied Stanislavski. My next older brother was an actor, and my oldest brother did some acting too. They were both in theater, and I wasn't. I was too intimidated. I went to music. But I began to intuit that there was something there, and I was very steeped in film at that point, and was reading people like Robert De Niro talking about, what do they call, hyper-real acting, or there's hyper-real, I can't remember the terms, it's been too long ago. But when I read about the method actors, I was always moved by Marlon Brando. Some of these actors are just like unbelievable. And as I began to read it, I think it was it's a very early exposure for me to this idea of empathic immersion. That's what a psychotherapist would call it, where you immerse yourself in a client's experience, and you stay open to inquiry until they say, "That's exactly it, Bob. That's exactly it." So it requires letting go of preconceptions and being willing to acknowledge error, because none of us get it right necessarily initially. And I haven't thought about that for years. My former wife, Tammy, sometimes watches these, and she'll remember when I was reading through these books on acting theory and technique. And I never have had one class on acting, which is abundantly apparent, I'm sure. I really appreciate what you're saying. Also, that it moves what we're talking about. It moves it out of having to be in the psychotherapeutic idiom. It's like, I think a good dancer, I know a good dancer, Angela, who's so involved here at the Vitality Project, would know this. As a dancer, my background's in music, specifically drumming, and as a drummer, my aspiration is to match and to add to. It's not to dominate or, all of that. It's to understand what's going on. It requires listening. In jazz, we call it somebody who has big ears. That means that's who you want to play with, somebody who has big ears. They listen well. And we can learn it from virtually any, or cultivate it in virtually any art form, and we can define art form very, very broadly.
Right.
Surely it can include gardening and a mechanic, and we can just go down the list. So I like very much opening it up. Yeah, that's good. That's good.
And being able to take that into the heat of the moment through having practiced it in whatever forms we choose to do too, which does not necessarily mean that we agree completely with another person either, or that we don't still have a vested interest in what we may prefer the outcome to be. We're still allowed to have preferences here.
Yeah.
It's a question of understanding that I'm not going to die if it's not exactly the way I want. It's developing the ability to be comfortable with discomfort.
I think about your last point. It's been up for me this summer in my quiet time. Is I don't know. It's only ever been the case, but I don't know that I've ever been so aware of it as right now at the ripe young age of 65, Douglas. Is that I'm aware of how many. What I want to say is like old reflexes from long ago in my life that I bring into the present. You think of a child and the vulnerability that every child has. Ava's vulnerable. Amanda used to be vulnerable. My 2 grandkids are vulnerable. It's understandable. And I've actually been feeling a lot of grace towards myself. But it's like if we don't really actively cultivate or update those old reflexes, they can stay with us across a lifetime. And I think why I'm bringing is I'm aware, and there's a grief involved and also a compassion. It's like it's almost like inside, and sometimes I literally do this in my meditations. It's like, it's okay, Bobby, you can let that down now. I've identified a part of me that's kind of the protector. I call him the soldier, and he's protected me in my life because there used to be somebody that needed to be protected. But and it's not that sometimes isn't relevant, but most often these interactions with our significant others aren't life and death. And maybe when we're infants or young children, it feels like that. And so I just really appreciate what you're saying to be able to risk and realize that our life isn't at stake, and that some part of me, at least, Doug, I'm aware, has continued to believe that across my lifespan, and that then constricts my options radically. Talk about either or. I either live or I die. Well, it's actually not like that.
Right.
And it allows them for, I actually prefer a kindly interaction, but if we have a little bit of static, or maybe even a lot of static, I could endure that. Maybe as a child, it feels like I'm going to lose my mom or dad or lose my life. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way right now. What I think of also, Doug, is that kind of, if we think of it in terms of requirements in adulthood, I see it as a huge addictive trigger, is one way to think about it, is that moving into that thinking, the requirement thinking, that kind of early kind of like survival-oriented thinking. It's really, it's an internal addictive trigger. There's a lot of talk in the 12-step program about external triggers, people's, places, and things, and that's valid. Maybe it has to do with my bias as a psychologist, but I feel like these internal addictive triggers are at least, if not more, undermining, in terms of our equilibrium, and open us to relapse risk. And so I feel like what we're talking about. In fact, I'm going to send this out here. I called it the math on this. The math on this is it's relatively straightforward. If we can disempower this reflex to move into requirements, we basically remove the power of any addictive trigger, and it increases our resilience. And like you're saying, even in the line of fire, we can be in the middle of a stressful interaction, and we don't have to go down. We don't have to go down.
And some of those responses, those times we move into requirement, are so deeply ingrained from such an early age that it takes some deconditioning to move out of that. It takes allowing it to happen, getting used to not doing it. If the reflex is still to go to that place, it's like anything. It's a practice to let go of those things, and slowly, one box at a time, the closet gets cleared out.
Yeah. Thank you, Doug, for that. It is a deconditioning. It's well put. It makes me think. I'll share something I do, and I'd like you to reflect on anything that you do that might pertain to this. And I don't need you to come up with something if you don't have something that comes to mind. But just as when you said that business of deconditioning, I'm aware that my practice in the morning, which involves my forgiveness practice at this point, involves a dialogue between different parts of myself. And I'll say, so to speak, because I don't really literalize them, but I mentioned the soldier a minute ago. I've got a soldier inside that's kind of hell-bent on protecting me at any cost, and he won't allow anybody to mess with me. And I don't demonize him. He's served me across my lifetime, but he's not really read up on the latest developments. And I've got another part of me that is looks and feels more overtly spiritual. I call him the monk. And I think he's more attuned to nuance. He's not a particularly good soldier. He needs a soldier at his behest. But the monk is if I can get the monk and the soldier into dialogue, and I do now. I do it almost every morning, including this morning. It's a fictitious dialogue. Jung called it active imagination. Other people use it in terms of different forms of journaling. It doesn't really matter what you call it. But it's one skillful means that I've developed, as you know, over the last few years. You and I worked together on this Freedom of Forgiveness project, and it was a lot about doing this with other people. What I didn't discuss in that project is I now do it more internally with different parts of myself. So I could ask you for forgiveness, or I can ask the monk for forgiveness, let's say. So I've been doing this inside, and what I want you to know is I think it's deconditioning. I'm going to use your word because it's a great word here. It's deconditioning a polarity, an either or type of thing that I've lived with so much of my life. It's informed what I was saying earlier, so that I really want to honor the protector. I call him the soldier. I want to honor him, but I don't want him to come in with a battle axe to every flippin' disagreement or a moment of friction. And he's beginning to relax a little bit, as long as he knows that the spiritual one, the monk, is open to his intervention if things are necessary. He might at this point say, Bob, we need to leave. The protector might say, we need to leave the situation. I've got a monk inside who is pretty much what the Buddhists would call a bodhisattva. He'll lay down his life for you, and that's a beautiful thing. My soldier does not comprehend that. And I'm trying to find a balance. And I like very much what you said a moment ago, which is, it isn't about giving up our truth or yielding our autonomy. And my soldier, really, that's his front yard. And yet I don't want to go through my life with these requirements kind of running amok, because I think it really is related to a lot of my addictive past, is having requirements on myself or on other relationships. And that requires an interaction between at least these two parts of myself, and I well imagine many other parts. So it's a daily practice for me, and I want you to know, having done this for I'd say the last 6 months, pretty much on a daily basis, I can feel something shifting inside for me. I'm like with Colleen last night. I was curt with her. I didn't aggress against her. I was curt, and the recovery was quicker than it might have been in the past. And it was healed today. There's no remainder. It's healed.
I love that freedom of forgiveness practice. It's been an important part of my recovery too, especially
Thank you.
in recent months. I've been doing it consistently, and it's great. I love the idea of doing it between parts of self. That never occurred to me. I haven't heard that dimension, but I can see how powerful that would be. Over the last 2 years, I've become fairly interested in internal family systems.
It's very much in that spirit. It's very much in that spirit.
Seems like a very valuable thing. I'd be interested in trying that first.
My thought about it, Doug, listen, we'll see how fate goes with this, but it might be interesting to do a second. I love what we created together. This track, by the way, we're talking about, Doug created beautiful, beautiful music, incredible music to accompany just some simple instructions for working with this issue, this dimension of forgiveness, not only of others, but self-forgiveness. So it's really kind of compassion practice. In the Buddhist tradition, they might talk about in terms of metta practice. It's really practicing self and other forgiveness. And as you and I shared in that experience together, that there's a CD out just called The Freedom of Forgiveness. As we shared in that, it's been the linchpin of my own recovery these last 10 years. This latter development, I haven't read about. If you practice guitar long enough, or play piano enough, or in my case, drum enough, you come up with stuff that you never thought of before. And that's literally what's happened with this freedom of forgiveness for me, is I've continued to practice it. Now it's moved into the internal, and occasionally I'll do with the outer, but it's almost all internal now. And it's the same dadgum dynamic, just applied within. And I think it's brilliant what you just said, to draw on Richard Schwartz's work on internal family systems, because that's really that's another languaging of what it is that's risen up organically for me. And I think it's really been instrumental to relaxing this death grip, or these requirements that I realize more now than before that I've lived with in my whole life.
I absolutely can see the value of doing that. I think it's worth exploring. I'm amazed that you have found that on your own and put those pieces together and come to that.
I'm always self-conscious talking about it, Douglas, because it's pretty damned esoteric unless you're the one doing it. It doesn't feel esoteric at all to me. So I appreciate your kindly response, and maybe there would be value in our doing it, especially in light of the fact that you've got your own depth in internal family systems, and there might be a wedding of resources. I'd love to talk about that with you. Yeah.
This whole dialogue that we're having now here too reminds me of a book I read some 10 or 15 years ago called The Tao of Sobriety, the thrust of which is looking at these different parts of yourself, seeing how they have affected your life, and then appointing what would be the equivalent of a higher self, or a capital S self, to be the manager and say, no, soldier, you're valuable for these reasons, and the monk, you're valuable for these reasons, and none of you get to be in charge right now, but I'm thankful to hear all of your opinions. And then the higher self is going to make decisions in the moment.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I'm writing this down. I'm writing it down for my own notes. I've read a book on the Tao of recovery. I can even picture the cover. I don't think I've read the Tao of sobriety. Is it, and that's the title, the Tao of sobriety?
Tao of sobriety. Yeah. I'll send you a screenshot.
I would like you to send me a link to it. I also want to write down just resources. I love what you just said. It'd be wonderful to read somebody that has developed it likely further than I've ever thought of. Here's Internal Family Systems by Richard Schwartz, who's this is really in its heyday right now in psychotherapy and so on like that. And it's a way of dialoguing between different parts of ourself. And then I mentioned Carl Jung, who early on developed this this approach to working with your different parts. He called it active imagination. And I'll put that up here. And the best book on active imagination was written by a friend of mine. He recently passed away, dear Robert, and it's a masterpiece on not only working with different parts of yourselves, but also working with dreams. It's Inner Work by Robert Johnson. So I highly recommend that. So for everybody who's watching this, these are resources that you might check out that give some suggestions for following this. And I'm just going to put down Doug's name here because you are such an incredible resource, Douglas. Doug Prater is my friend here tonight, colleague in arms. And our collaboration is a CD with a number of different tracks on it, simply called Freedom of Forgiveness, and it's on 𝗂𝘼𝗥 Technologies, if I can type here, and it's available. If you just look that up, you can find that. If you have an interest in this, your music, as I've told you, your music accompanies oftentimes when I'm writing. I'll just put on the instrumental part because the words distract me. But I think it's incredible. And that's just scratching the surface with your contributions musically on 𝗂𝘼𝗥, among other things. More to follow on this, Doug, as always. One of the things I was thinking about is I've always had an interest in psychology. I've always had an interest in the psychology of creativity. Mm-hmm. And years ago, I was corresponding with some researchers in Stockholm, of all places. They were doing laboratory research, interestingly, on the creative process. And they were able to reduce creativity down to two different strands. It's obviously more complicated than this, but they were looking at these two variables. And they said, what's interesting with these two variables is that they seem like they're mutually exclusive, and they're both necessary for creative process. And one of them is focus. To be able to focus on something, you need to, and let's say it's on your guitar playing, you need to focus on that, and you know this. But right in the midst of that is this other, let's say this plane or axis, and they call that flexibility. Mm-hmm. So it's the ability to focus with flexibility. So mm-hmm. Here you and I are tonight. We come from different backgrounds. We have much overlap, but we come from different backgrounds, different days, different instruments that we play, et cetera, and different resources and so on. And something comes of that as we're focused on this topic tonight. This is creative what just happened. And this is how it goes with the creative process. I'm grateful for that. One of my favorite researchers in creative process is a psychiatrist at Harvard. His name is Albert Rothenberg, and he refers to creative process as homospatial process. Mm-hmm. And what that means is homo means single or one, and spatial means in a space. So it means bringing two things into the space, call them Doug Prater and Bob Weathers, and have them interact and have them co-create something that never was there before. We just did.
Yeah.
And by the way, what we're talking about moving requirements to preferences is moving from inflexible requirements to flexible preferences. The limbic system, particularly when it's activated, is remarkably inflexible. Mm-hmm. And the frontal cortex, or the executive system, as it gets reactivated around preferences, it's the seat of our creativity. And so what we've talked about tonight has multiple benefits, right? Doug, I don't want to keep you any longer. I appreciate you staying up late. Doug's in North Carolina, and I'm here in Southern California, so we have a 3-hour difference. I wish you a good night's rest. Doug, thank you so much for all your contributions. It's such a blessing being with you. And we'll be back here together in a couple of weeks together with Douglas, okay? Yeah. Thank you, Doug.
Pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. Take good care. Bye-bye, everybody. Have a good night. Mm-hmm.